Share. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the monthly Fire Safe Sonoma speaker series. We live stream this program on the fourth Thursday of every month, except for the month of December, and on the third Thursday of November. We don't do Thanksgiving. You can find our past speaker series programs on our YouTube channel. There's a lot of great information there, so check it out. You'll see the link in the chat. I'm Roberta McIntyre, the President and CEO of Fire Safe Sonoma, and I'll be your host today. For those folks who might not know, Fire Safe Sonoma is the countywide fire safety council, serving Sonoma County for 26 years. Yep, that's right. I've been doing work in this space before a while then fire safety and risk reduction was popular. Before we get started, I want to thank Team Fire Safe Sonoma today for helping out. With us today is I think Emily's here, not sure, but Emily is a part of our Fire Safe Sonoma team. She's our county coordinator assigned to projects and programs. And then Becca, sorry, Fisher, our past fellow, who is now our program assistant. She's helping out today. And also helping us out today are 4 California Climate Action Corps fellows. Woohoo! Aiden DeYoung, Alina Brammer, Malia Zimmerman, and Julie Edwards. So thank you guys. This program could not be possible without all your guys' help. And don't forget to check out the Fire Safe Sonoma calendar on our website for upcoming events. And if you have any upcoming events, send them our way. Send them to Becca. She's our comms person, or she's the person who handles our comms. If you have any events would like posted on our public facing calendar, send them over to Becca. And the only thing I ask is that you make sure that they are relevant to wildland fire safety and risk reduction, because that's what we do, and we try to stay in our lane. Don't forget about these upcoming events. Speaking of events on our public facing calendar, we have our regular Fire Safe Sonoma board meeting on April 28th at 3:30. Sign up through our website. Fire Safe Sonoma will be tabling alongside the Resilient Landscape Coalition at the Climate Ready Katati Fair this Saturday, March 29th, from 10 to 2 p.m. This fair will provide information and resources on promoting climate resiliency, increasing your connection with the local environment, and leading a more sustainable lifestyle. Fire Safe Sonoma will also have a float in the Butter and Eggs Parade on April 19th from 10 to 5 in downtown Petaluma. Come check it out. I hope you like our float. We're putting a lot of work into it. I would love to tell you more about it, but I'm going to keep you all in suspense. Go to the parade, check out our float. It's going to be cool. We worked on it all day yesterday. And to stay in the loop, subscribe to our updates. We try to do a weekly update of stuff going on. And also, if you have any things you want us to share out at our weekly updates, send them to Becca as well. So our last speaker series was held in February, where we heard from Ariella Lutz and Devin Fredfill, who discussed the fundamentals of prescribed burns and their role in fire management and ecosystem health. The presentation is now on our YouTube channel, so feel free to check that out after watching today's speaker series. We don't want you to leave now. This month, we are pleased to be joined by Ariella Chichilnisky du Lac, who will share how healthy watersheds, decreasing wildfire risk, and increasing resilience can create value to support projects, and how financing can play a role in supporting watershed and ecosystem restoration. Ariella is a senior project associate at Blue Forest. She works primarily on developing and advancing conservation finance projects in California on both public and private lands. And she has been co-leading Blue Forest exploration of project opportunities in the North Bay area. So with that, let's welcome Arielle, and handing it off to you. Arielle, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thanks, Roberta, for that nice introduction. Really, really excited to be here. I have some slides prepared, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can I get a yes or thumbs up from somebody to confirm that it's being shared?
It's shared.
Awesome. Thanks, Roberta. Wonderful. Yeah. So, well, thank you all for joining. I'm super, super excited to be here today to share a little bit about Blue Forest, which is the nonprofit where I work, and some of the work we do in building and establishing resilience through restoration and conservation finance. I We'll be talking for about 30 or 35 minutes or so. I'll pause about halfway through for some questions after a couple of particularly complex slides, and then also at the end. But feel free to also drop questions in the chat throughout. I believe it'll be moderated. So happy to answer any questions that you all might have. Definitely welcome questions. Love talking about whatever people are curious to hear about. So I think I'll start today by talking a little bit about Blue Forest and what we focus on, namely conservation finance. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the main problem statements that we are addressing. So ecosystem resilience as a whole, as well as the risk of catastrophic wildfire in the Western US and the US more broadly, and talk a little bit about one of the solutions we see to this, which is forest and ecosystem restoration. I'll then talk specifically about one of the tools that we use at Blue Forest to help support partners on the ground carrying out this restoration work. That tool is a financial vehicle called the Forest Resilience Bond. We think it's pretty cool. I'm excited to share about it and hear any questions you all might have. Following that, I'll sort of step back a little bit and talk about the role that we see finance being able to play broadly in the conservation system, as well as describe how we've been bringing sort of novel and unique sources of funding to support ecosystem restoration projects. And I will finish up by talking a little bit about how Blue Forest is thinking about investing in the forestry restoration space more broadly. Our FRBs tackle one specific part of the space, and we've also been thinking sort of more holistically how to support partners doing the work that they do. So with that, I will just dive right into talking a little bit about Blue Forest. So we are a nonprofit, as I mentioned, and our goal is to accelerate ecological restoration through conservation finance. And what this really means is bringing innovative financial and funding tools and mechanisms, as well as science, to ecological restoration projects to help accelerate their pace and scale. Blue Forest was founded in 2015, and we became official partners of the US Forest Service in 2017. So to date, a lot of our work has been on large projects on US Forest Service land, but we've been in the process of branching out and exploring other sorts of projects, either on other types of public lands, as well as private lands, such as those in Sonoma County and the North Bay area more generally. That's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here talking to you all today, is because, as Roberta mentioned, I've been co-leading some of our exploration in the North Bay area, and particularly in Sonoma and Napa counties, to discover how Blue Forest may be able to support some of the great ecological restoration work happening in the area. And just as a fun side note, this team picture up here was taken in Mendocino, so relatively close to home. If home is Sonoma for you. So just a fun fact there. So at Blue Forest, we have 3 areas of expertise: science, finance, and collaboration. So science comes in through the environmental and economic quantification of benefits associated with forest, watershed, and ecosystem restoration. So this can look different for different types of restoration, of course. But some of the main benefits that we often consider are reduced wildfire risk, increased water quantity and quality, and increased healthy habitat for wildlife. We blend this quantification of benefits with communication of these benefits. So under this broader science bucket, we're trying to understand what the benefits are of ecosystem restoration and who might care about them. And this gets combined with finance. So as I mentioned, we apply various conservation finance mechanisms to help support projects, deploying both loans and investments, as well as additional funding that we may be able to bring in to support ecosystem restoration projects. And the last part of this, the collaboration piece, is really, really key. We couldn't do our work without collaborating with wonderful community partners on the ground. We've also been prioritizing partnering with local Native nations and organizations to help promote co-stewardship on the project areas that we're looking at. And so this leads me to a sort of overall point about the type of work we do at Blue Forest, which is we don't plan or prioritize any of these projects. Rather, we come into landscapes and communicate and learn from the folks, the partners on the ground who are actually have an understanding of what needs to happen on the landscape and are planning and carrying out these projects. We want to come in and partner with organizations to support their projects and priorities through bringing this blend of science, finance, and collaboration. So that was a little bit about Blue Forest, and with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem statement, or at least one of the problem statements that we think a lot about in terms of trying to address, namely, land in communities at risk of moderate to severe wildfire in the US and particularly in the Western US. So I imagine most of you are California and Sonoma residents, and so I'm sure you have some sense of the risk that wildfire poses to land, communities, and people. But I'll just throw out a few significant facts to sort of underscore this point and why we feel so strongly at Blue Forest about helping mitigate wildfire risk. So in the Western US, around 58 million acres are at moderate to high wildfire risk. And in the US more broadly, somewhere around 4.5 million homes are at high to extreme risk of being in wildfire areas. This obviously is extremely problematic for the ecosystems, homes, individuals, families, communities living in these areas, and also produces significant economic burden. So in the US broadly, between $400 and $900 billion of annual economic burden come about from wildfire. And then zooming a little bit more back into the Western US, if we look at what we would need to do to treat these landscapes and make them safer, we see a massive funding gap. So to treat around 50 million acres of land in the Western US to decrease wildfire risk, we'd need somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. Currently, only $5 billion are allocated, $1 billion of which or so is in California. Obviously, there's a huge, huge funding gap here, and this is a broad problem that really needs to be addressed and isn't being addressed at the scale that it needs to be, which is where we're excited about coming in and hoping that we can help support these projects and decrease wildfire risk to land and communities. So one of the ways we really think about work that can help decrease wildfire risk is through forest management. Broadly defined, we think about forest management as the process of taking a degraded forest, which I'll define in a second, and applying a number of different restoration and fuels reduction techniques to that degraded forest, resulting in a much healthier, more resilient forest that provides more of the ecological benefits that we see coming from healthy forests and ecosystems. So when I talk about a degraded forest, particularly within the context of wildfire, one of the primary things I'm talking about is a forest that has gone through a regime of wildfire suppression. The forests in the Western US are actually fire adapted, which means they need healthy wildfire to come through, reduce surface fuels and smaller trees to function best and be most resilient. Until about the 1800s or 1850s, this was exactly what was happening in these forests. Before there were any humans in the area, it would just be natural wildfires caused by lightning strikes and similar events. And once there were humans living in the area, these were supplemented through prescribed and cultural burns by indigenous groups living in the area. All of this led to a healthy, resilient forest that thrived with small beneficial fires coming through. However, in the last 2 centuries or so, wildfire suppression techniques began, in which every wildfire that started was immediately stamped out. Initially, this seemed like a positive thing because generally wildfire seems a little scary. But the truth is, these ecosystems really relied on wildfire to maintain healthy levels of trees and surface fuels. And once the wildfires were suppressed and continued to be suppressed, a lot of fuel built up very quickly. That meant that sometimes when wildfires would come through, if they weren't suppressed, and of course not all could be suppressed, they would really go up in flames, as it were. All of these surface fuels and small diameter trees catching on fire. And unlike the healthy, beneficial small wildfires that used to be coming through the landscape, this results in catastrophic wildfires like the kind we've been seeing in California and the Western US, where entire forests and ecosystems are absolutely devastated due to the fact that these fires were fueled by more than they should have been. So we look at forest management, removing these fuels, applying beneficial prescribed fire, removing invasive species that may be too flammable, and generally restoring the meadows and ecosystems in the area as one technique and tool that can really help improve ecosystem resilience, reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, and allow an ecosystem to provide the numerous benefits it does provide for humans, communities, and of course the wildlife also living in the ecosystem. So with all that context in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the specific ways that Blue Forest approaches supporting projects that carry out these various forest management techniques to help decrease the risk of wildfire and improve ecosystem resilience. And the way we do that is through what we call our Forest Resilience Bond, or FRB. So the FRB is a combination of funding and financing that we use to support organizations who are carrying out ecological restoration projects, often forest restoration projects, on the ground. It has a combination of a 0% interest loan as well as additional grant funding to these organizations. As I said, a lot of our FRBs have been launched on US Forest Service land, and what that has looked like is one organization carrying out one singular project on a massive amount of land, thousands of acres, because that's the sort of terrain we're looking at with the US Forest Service. As we transition into other types of public lands, as well as private lands, we're looking more at an organization who might be able to aggregate multiple smaller plots of land owned by individual landowners or organizations to get at that scale of thousands of acres that we're looking at in order to deploy a forest resilience bond. An example of such an organization might be a local resource conservation district or something similar. So, the first thing to know about the Forest Resilience Bond is one of the key pieces that we are trying to support here is organizations that receive reimbursement-based grants to do the work that they're doing. So reimbursement-based grants can be federal, state, or local grants for which an ecological restoration organization applies. When they receive the grant, if it's reimbursement-based, what'll happen is the organization will pay to carry out whatever project they've decided to carry out, and then wait for the grant to reimburse them however much money they spent carrying out that project. So as a toy example of this, let's say a local organization carries out $1 million worth of work in terms of ecosystem restoration on a specific project area. That organization will hire contractors to actually do that work. But then that $1 million that has been spent to carry out that work now has to be reimbursed by the grant. And this reimbursement timeline can be problematic. So it can be 6 months or even a year for an organization to wait to get reimbursed by the grant. As you can imagine, a year is a long time to be waiting for the $1 million you spent on a project to be reimbursed. It's often untenable for organizations or the contractors who need to get paid for these projects to wait for that money to be reimbursed for 6 months or a year and float that capital themselves. And this means that fewer projects are able to get done, and as they get done, they may get done more slowly, given the need for these organizations and contractors to wait for the reimbursement to come through from the grants. So this is where the financing piece of the Forest Resilience Bond comes in. We offer a 0% interest loan through the Forest Resilience Bond to these organizations that have applied for these reimbursement-based grants. So to go back to the toy example that I just used, let's say an organization has applied for a reimbursement-based grant and carries out $1 million worth of work. Well, the Forest Resilience Bond will then loan them that $1 million until the grant reimburses that organization the $1 million that they spent, at which point that organization will give that money back to the Forest Resilience Bond. So that $1 million is loaned to them without interest, allowing them to cover any cash flow constraints they might have. So the financing piece comes from different types of investors, both private and foundation investors, all of whom are generally interested in supporting work of this sort with their capital. They're the ones deploying the upfront capital to the Forest Resilience Bond, so they'd be putting $1 million in to get loaned out to the organization. Notably, these investors are looking for a small amount of interest as a return for their investment. It's below market rate. They're not looking for too much money, but they are looking for some interest because they are loaning their money. But as I said, the loan that the Forest Resilience Bond offers to the organizations is 0% interest. So we needed to find a way to also cover that small amount of interest that investors require from this loan. So that's partly where the funding piece of the FRB comes in. Although the funding that we generate for the FRB goes both to covering interest as well as to providing granted funding, with not being loaned, being granted to these organizations so that they can carry out even more work. The funding piece of this, I think, is pretty exciting. It comes from a number of sources that may seem non-traditional, but that ultimately really benefit from these ecological restoration projects that we are looking to fund and finance. So here are a couple main examples of the sorts of organizations that we appeal to get funding for this work. Utilities, corporates, recreation operators, and government agencies are all some of the types of beneficiaries, as we call them, who may be interested in putting funding into the Forest Resilience Bond to be granted to the organizations. I'll talk a little bit more shortly about why these organizations in particular might be interested in putting money into this, especially because, as I said, these organizations aren't getting paid back. They're not loaning, they're just granting money because these restoration activities positively affect their economic bottom line. Last thing I will say about this before pausing for questions is the workings of the Forest Resilience Bond and the loan associated with that don't go towards paying, for example, my salary or supporting Blue Forest. Blue Forest is a nonprofit, so we are funded through other sources such as grants and philanthropic donations from foundations. This whole financing structure is there to serve and support the local organizations who are carrying out the restoration work that I've mentioned. So obviously there's a lot going on this slide, and I think almost always when anybody at Blue Forest presents this slide, we get questions. I'm absolutely happy to take some questions now, so feel free to just raise your hand and then hopefully I'll be able to see it, or at least somebody from Fire Safe Sonoma will be able to see it and call on you. But really the big takeaway here is the FRB blends funding and financing. Ooh, Charles, go for it.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. When I see the funders there, I'm a suspicious person, and I wonder if they have any input into what the treatments look like. That's question number one. Or number two, do you, as the middle person here, between the funders and the grantees, do you have requirements about what the work looks like on the ground? Because I can imagine utilities, corporates, well, recreation operators and government agencies now, we might say, knowing what the Forest Service is trying to do at this moment, might have their own concerns about how much stuff's taken out of the forest and what it looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. Totally understand the suspicion element of it. One of the things we make sure not to get involved with as an organization is the planning or permitting of these projects. So when we're looking at the projects and bringing them to these various funder types, we're presenting them the projects as they exist. They don't get any input. They often are still interested in putting money into the projects because ecosystem restoration just does affect everybody positively if you have a healthy ecosystem. But it's a great question. We definitely aren't interested in changing work at all to meet what our funders might want. We want actual trained foresters and folks who know what they're doing to plan out, permit, and carry out these projects.
So you don't have any say in, or you don't wish to have any say in what, for example, a Forest Service entity wants to do in terms of fuel treatments.
That's correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Any follow-ups from that or any other questions from folks before I keep going? Okay. Awesome. Yeah, as I said, feel free to drop questions in the chat as I keep going. I love good questions and conversations from folks. But if there's no more for now, I will continue. And the next thing I want to do is sort of zoom out just a little bit and talk more broadly about why we're implementing this conservation finance thing. And I think something that a lot of folks may initially think when they see conservation finance is, does that really make sense? Why is finance being used in this ecological restoration and conservation space? Is it actually helpful? And it is. And I think that's really exciting. Finance can be a super powerful tool for good in this space. And you may have some sense now of how it can be applied through the Forest Resilience Bond. And I just kind of want to double down on that and highlight some of the specific ways that conservation finance can be immensely helpful in supporting projects and conservation goals more broadly. So the first of these is that conservation finance can really help accelerate the pace of operations. So again, going back to the toy example of the $1 million loan, if an organization doesn't have to wait around to get reimbursed, they can keep paying money to their contractors to carry out more work on the ground, rather than needing to wait that timeline as the grant reimburses them, meaning operation pace can really speed up. In a sort of similar vein in some ways, conservation finance can really serve to unlock and attract more capital to the landscape and projects that the conservation finance mechanism is focusing on. So part of this is for a similar reason to what I was just describing. Conservation finance, such as loans from the FRB, can free up working capital to be used for other projects. If an organization has that $1 million loan to them, they can keep working on other projects or the same project rather than not having that $1 million accessible as it's being held by the grant and waiting to be reimbursed. But I think also, importantly, conservation finance projects can be really exciting to other funders, investors, and organizations in general. So these sorts of projects can really attract attention to the landscape, drawing in more funding, more financing, and more excitement about the work that's being carried out. And then the last piece that we really see conservation finance playing a very positive role in is in its ability to support local economies. So this primarily comes in, again, through the ability for loans to be deployed such that nobody has to wait around for grant reimbursement. Smaller organizations who might not be able to float $1 million as they wait for reimbursement are now able to take on projects, and the same with contractors. And so smaller local contractors or other organizations won't be prohibited by costs or cash flow constraints and can get involved in these projects, whereas previously it might have been untenable and a larger organization might have had to come in from somewhere else to carry out the project because they had the ability to float that $1 million. So I found this really exciting. I think finance, like I said, can be a really, really powerful tool and not always in obvious ways. But we've found that through the FRB and through conservation finance more generally, we're really able to help folks accelerate the pace of their operations, attract and unlock more capital, and support local economies and local communities who are interested in engaging this work, but might not have been able to otherwise due to having cash flow issues. So that sort of wraps the financing piece of the forest resilience bond that we've been focusing on. And the thing I'd like to talk about now is this other piece, the funding piece, and how we're able to bring in organizations like utilities and corporations, who again aren't participating at all in the planning or permitting of these projects, but are rather coming in and being informed about what the project is, and then oftentimes finding interest in it and wanting to put money in. So I'll talk about this first through the context of all of the different benefits that we see associated with forest restoration and really ecosystem restoration more generally, because different organizations and entities are excited about different benefits. I've already talked a lot about wildfire risk reduction, but definitely don't want to forget it. That's a biggie, especially for organizations like power utilities or folks worried about community safety. However, as you can see from this picture, we have a number of other benefits that are also really compelling to different groups. So one of the other main ones that we often look at are water benefits, water quantity and quality benefits. And I want to zoom in quickly on the water quantity benefit because it may not be super obvious. And so the reason water quantity, an increase in water quantity specifically, can occur through forest restoration projects is because the smaller trees and brush and other living fuels on the ground that need to be removed are sucking up water from the landscape in order to survive. Once they are removed, which again used to occur through natural small fires but has stopped occurring, there is more water present on the landscape to flow through rivers, streams, and lakes. This can be beneficial to anybody who's using that water on the landscape, either for their own operations or to provide water for others. We also see a number of other benefits, including infrastructure and community protection and power supply reliability, as well as benefits like local economy benefits, habitat and biodiversity, and protected recreation opportunities. And I'm sure you all can think of other benefits associated with ecosystem restoration because there are so many fantastic ones. The ones I put up here on this slide are just some of the main ones we use when we're talking to these potential funders to inform them of the fact that ecosystem restoration really does help all of us, and this may positively affect their economic bottom line. So with that, I want to dive a little more into these sort of different types of beneficiaries, the funders of these projects, and why they might care. Because it isn't necessarily immediately obvious why, let's say, a corporation might want to put money into a project other than just through goodwill. But the truth is, ecological restoration really can benefit the economic bottom line of all these folks in a different way based on different benefits. So starting with utilities, we see, particularly for power utilities, a lot of interest in protected infrastructure and liability risk reduction. So to provide another little toy example to illustrate this, imagine a power utility with power lines and infrastructure running through a forest. A couple things could happen. So let's say the power line somehow causes a fire. Then that utility might be facing significant liability issues and have to pay out a lot. But even if it's not the power line itself that starts the fire, if a wildfire were to come through that area, that infrastructure held by the power utility would likely be damaged or destroyed, meaning more money to pay for reparation as well as potentially power supply issues. And then on the water utility side of things, we really see this increased water quantity, increased water supply benefit playing a big role in their decision-making around supporting these projects. For corporations, which I'm using as a pretty broad term, we also see a lot of interest in increased water supply, but also interest in supporting community resilience or trying to meet various corporate social responsibility goals. Tourism and recreation operators may be a slightly more obvious one, but I'll still provide a few examples of why they might be excited about this. So a recreation operator who helps support fishing on the landscape and is paid to do so, obviously is going to benefit more if there are healthy, happy fish that are prevalent in the streams and rivers. On the other hand, an operator like a ski resort, for example, might be worried that during the summer, a wildfire could come through near their resort and damage it, both obviously causing risks to these assets that they would need to pay for, but also potentially causing risks down the line, as depending on how long it takes to recover that infrastructure and repair it, there could be a risk of revenue loss for that organization. And to finish up, the last sort of category of beneficiaries that we often think about are state and local governments, who are certainly interested in the local economic growth benefits that I've mentioned a few times, as well as general community protection, as a lot of communities, particularly those in the wildland-urban interface, may be at risk of wildfire from nearby forests or ecosystems, and their local government might be interested in helping support risk reduction in that vein. And so the last thing I kind of want to say a little bit about the beneficiaries and what motivates them and how we engage them is we really think about beneficiaries often sort of as a place-based. So depending on what project we're looking at, we'll analyze what benefits come out of the project that is occurring, and then think about who might care, who locally or nearby might have a vested interest in the project. So again, right, you might see it making more sense for a power utility who has lines running through a forest to want to pay for restoration of that forest than, for example, a power utility that doesn't have any lines running through a forest. So for each individual project, we zoom in, understand what of that suite of benefits I mentioned might be particularly occurring here and who might care. So with that, I am coming to my last slide, which is just talking a little bit more about how Blue Forest thinks about investing in the forest restoration system at a broader level. So I've already mentioned, of course, our forest resilience bonds, and I've put up here watershed resilience bonds as well, which are very similar to forest resilience bonds, but involve a broader swath of land with smaller parcels of land. So think something closer to private lands work. This sort of thing might be more applicable in Sonoma County and in surrounding counties. These FRBs and WRBs really focus on funding and financing the implementation of projects, which is obviously a critical piece of the puzzle, but not the entire puzzle. And so we created Blue Forest Asset Management to funnel money from investors into all other parts of the forestry supply chain. And one specific example of this that I'd like to bring up and talk a little bit about is our California Wildfire Innovation Fund, or CWIF. So CWIF does sort of exactly what it sounds like. It helps invest in various innovations in California around decreasing wildfire risk. And really, these funds go towards every dimension of the forestry supply chain, particularly at the end, in which there needs to be solutions towards utilizing the end products of forestry, such as woody biomass. And just as a cool example of what CWIF has done, it invested in Tahoe Forest Products, which is a cool small community sawmill in the Tahoe area. And just to loop back to what I mentioned at the beginning about our intention to collaborate with Indigenous partners, one cool thing about Tahoe Forest Products is it exists on Washoe land. And so the folks who run it lease that, that area from the Washoe people, and also primarily try to hire folks from the Washoe tribe to work at that sawmill. So just a great example of promotion of co-stewardship and collaboration between local communities and Indigenous partners. And then the last piece of sort of investing in this forest restoration system that I want to briefly mention is our exploration of the ability to potentially invest in workforce development. So this, as I said, is just an exploration. We don't have a specific fund or anything set up yet, but we recognized that workforce development is a key part of helping support forest and ecosystem restoration. And so we're in the process of conducting interviews and trying to figure out how Blue Forest, with our investment abilities and various skill sets, may be able to help within this space. So I've been talking for a bit, so I think it's time to turn it over to you all for any questions. But first, I will just say thank you so much for listening. It's been a blast to chat with you all, and feel free to reach out to me. My email's up there, and Roberta and other folks also have it in case you didn't write it down but want to reach out to me later.
Okay, great. Thank you for that awesome presentation. And a lot of this is kind of over my head, but it is definitely interesting. And let me look and see what we got in the queue for questions. If I can figure out where I put that. There it is, right there. Pat asked, when you talk about vegetation treatments on 1,000-acre scales, what type of treatments are involved? The forest that has been left to degrade, removing understory is necessary before prescribed fires is safe, absolutely. Mechanical treatments on 1,000 acres is a huge endeavor. So can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the area, right? Different forests require different treatments. Even different specific areas within forests may have been interrupted by wildfires in different ways. And I think to the point of mechanical thinning, for example, being a huge endeavor, that's a really big part of why we're trying to come in and support. We want to provide that additional funding and that financing to help make that huge endeavor possible, even if there are cash flow constraints or funding gaps on the ground.
Thank you. And hopefully, Pat, that answers your question well. I do have a question, an overarching question, and I apologize if you already covered it, but I don't think you did. It feels like a lot of the services you offer are for forest restoration or restoration projects. If a fire safety project is in a pipeline, can you guys help with that, or does that wildfire safety and risk reduction project have to have an element of forest restoration to be able to have you all help out?
Yeah, so we haven't really historically been involved with things like home hardening. Um, what we're tending to look at are ecosystem restoration projects that either help with fire or other ecosystem degradation, but it doesn't have to be a forest necessarily. It can be a different kind of ecosystem, such as a meadow or grassland or something along those lines.
Yeah, so how would we describe a project to make it appealing to you all? Let's say, for example, we have a project that is a community field break, okay, with the main focus on reducing the amount of vegetation to slow down a fire, or even possibly, stop it in its tracks in a perfect world. Um, how would we characterize that if we're starting from, okay, we want to make this fire field break, but how do we call it a restoration project to get y'all to help? I think that's what I'm trying to get to.
Are you pitching a project to me, Roberta?
Not necessarily, just a hypothetical project,
A
yes.
hypothetical. Okay.
Yeah, but
Hypothetically,
conceptually that exists.
hypothetically, I would say let's find some time to chat about this afterwards. But the the short answer that I'll provide now is we'd be looking for something that has a variety of benefits to the local ecosystem and is also at the sort of scale that we're looking at, which, as I mentioned, is relatively big. The thing with financing is it doesn't really make sense for a loan to be cost effective if we're not loaning to at least somewhere around $1 million. And that's a big ballpark. So, but something along those lines, although we might be able to do a little bit less depending on the merit and value of the project.
So how about this? We've got another question in the queue. Thanks, Lynn. I'll get to it in a second because I'm kind of inspired a little bit here. So let's say hypothetically, we have a county-wide project where we've identified geographies throughout the county who have an insidious amount of broom that needs to be eradicated. I imagine eradicating broom, an invasive species, could be considered a forest restoration project that would probably fit the bill for you all. If we do it county-wide, I'm sure we could get to the $1 million mark. Is that something y'all might be interested in?
Certainly, that is something we might be interested in. And
Okay.
more information, if more information is to come, you know where I live on email. Would love to hear more.
Yeah, because we have a lot of areas throughout county where I think folks would be really interested in eradicating that nuisance.
Totally, right.
And it's not easy to eradicate because you have to do it right.
Right. Yeah, and it's so
Wow.
important to
Yeah.
have native species as the predominant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Lynn asked, how do you evaluate projects to decide what you think is most marketable before you invest your time? And how do you communicate with project proposers?
To the second part, how do you communicate with project proposers? We tend to communicate exactly like I'm chatting with Roberta right now, just on Zoom. Blue Forest is completely remote, so we'll meet with folks all around California, Western US, beyond, and get in touch with folks who have heard of us and might be interested in our projects or who we see having really interesting projects. As for the first part of the question, the evaluation, we have a science team at Blue Forest, and we can carry out sort of various levels of scientific and economic analysis through that. So we'd start out by looking at a proposed project. First, sort of, this initial discussion of sort of how big is the project is one part of it, but then we start looking at the specific treatment activities associated with the project. So is there a lot of thinning that might result in an increase in water quantity? Is it a post-fire project that might really help with water quality or decrease reburn risk? We have a variety of ways of sort of thinking about this, and I could nerd out about it for a while, but if you want to hear more, just email me and I'm happy to share more about that.
Right. We're a little short on questions, but we have like 10 minutes left. So I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit, maybe. Not in a bad way, I hope. But can you describe for us um, two project types? One that you've experienced, one that you guys attempted to be engaged with that didn't go well, and maybe explain why it didn't go well so we can learn from that experience, and maybe describe a project that you've done or are doing that is absolutely remarkable and outstanding.
Yeah, happy to. I like being put on the spot. It's fun. It makes my brain really, really turn, you know. So I think I'll speak generally to the sort of negative part of this question, what hasn't always gone well. And the truth is the beneficiary engagement piece of this can be challenging, particularly because I think broadly there isn't really a mindset that leads to beneficiaries sort of immediately understanding why they might want to put money into ecosystem restoration. And so as an organization, we're sort of trying to connect with folks and really change mindsets around that, but that's a slow process. That is not to say that we haven't done it. We totally have, and it's been really, really cool and exciting. But there are some project areas that may not have the most obvious beneficiaries, such as projects in really rural areas where there aren't any utilities nearby, for example. And then on the flip side of this, some of our most successful projects, I'll speak a little bit about our first FRB that was launched back in 2020, I believe it was, maybe 2019, which was the Yuba 1 FRB in the Tahoe National Forest. And this was a really exciting project, not only because it was our first FRB, but because we got a beneficiary, Yuba Water Agency, that was really excited and engaged. And the entire process helped catalyze the formation of a broader group of stakeholders on the ground who were really excited about supporting this sort of work. Also, the way we often think about our forest resilience bonds is a pilot to scale model. Start small, scale up from there. The Yuba one was a relatively small FRB, and since then we've scaled up to the Yuba 2, which is much larger, still both on the many thousands of acres, but we're going even larger to carry out more of this work once we get buy-in from the local landscape.
Yeah. But a price point of $1 million, that doesn't seem like a quote small project to me.
Well, small sort of depends on the landscapes you're looking at. That's a very fair point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Particularly with, in the space that Fire Safe Sonoma works often.
Totally. Yeah.
Another question came in from Erica. How does one even present a project? Do you come out and assess whether assess whether it's a viable project? What does that workflow, if you will, look like?
Yeah.
So does somebody call you up and say, hey, do you want to do a site visit, etc.?
We do get to do site visits, which is a great part of the job because, it's like, oh, for work, I'm going to go out to this forest and explore, which is awesome. But as a more serious answer to that question, yeah, the way we connect with folks really depends. But usually, in order to start assessing and presenting the benefits of a project, we'll ask for shape files or maps of the project, as well as treatment areas. And then there are various types of software that our science team uses to identify, if this project were to occur versus if it weren't to occur, what would the wildfire risk reduction look like? So I hope that answered that question, but happy for a follow-up if it didn't totally answer it.
Okay, and then Erica, if that didn't answer you well enough, go ahead and put a follow-up question in the chat for us. And then in the meantime, Sarah writes, these sort of projects require environmental review and planning, which need an upfront investment for that environmental review and the CEQA. And then Sarah further writes, I think I heard you say that your program covers only implementation. Where do you think community groups might find funding for the initial work? I think what she's asking about is what I call the soft work, the project development, and in particular, sounds like in this case, the environmental review work, which, on a small project where a CEQA was required and it's not eligible for a categorical exemption, you're talking about upwards of $1,500.
Totally. Not to mention, we've heard a lot from various folks in Sonoma that landowner engagement on an individual landowner level also takes a lot of investment. The short answer is stay tuned, because that's something we're starting to think through internally, particularly as we understand these issues in Sonoma and surrounding counties. As I mentioned, we don't want to get too involved in the planning because we don't want it to seem like these beneficiaries are at all influencing the planning. But we are trying to think through whether there are ways that we can support this sort of work without having it seem like our beneficiaries are influencing it at all.
Have you guys by chance shopped around for projects? Like, I think CAL FIRE has a site where projects are entered. And, I think that don't remember where exactly it was, but I ran across it in the last few weeks. And it's a site where you can go look at type of project, whether it was funded or not, and its current status. Do you guys ever look at places like that to go hunt for projects that might be viable, or do you rely on, folks like us saying, hey, we got a project, come help us?
Some combo. I think a lot of the latter, and also where we're working depends a little bit on how Blue Forest is getting funded. For example, we might get some funding from one organization to sort of focus in on a certain area, not a certain project, but a certain geographic area. But feel free to follow up with that link if you think that's something that might be exciting for us to see, Roberta. And also to all of you on here, if there are any kind of projects or orgs that come to mind in the area that might be carrying out these sorts of projects that you think we should connect with, definitely reach out and let me know. I'm all ears and just excited to keep the work moving.
Yeah, so I would suggest folks, if you're part of a local fire safe council, take a look at your priority projects there. See if there's something you have in the queue that you might need to develop further and, this might be a good fit, who knows? Same with if you're Firewise community, check your action plans, see what kind of projects you might have in there. And then in both of those cases, if you have any projects, I'm going to do a shameless plug here for Fire Safe Snowman Measure H. If y'all have any projects that are on your action plan or in your priority project list that is something like roadside, where you've got a good percentage of community commitment, landowner uh, collaboration, where they'll let us come on the property and do work. If you got a project like that, then let us know because we can help you walk the categorical exemption through the county and also funnel Measure H funds, not Measure H funds, but Measure H um, funded crews to come out and do that work. Those are what we're shooting for with regard to Measure H projects in our first year of being a collaborator on that. So again, if to simplify that, if you've got a roadside project where you've got at least 70% landowner commitment, let us know because that's an easy button for us right now. We want to start pointing crews in the direction of those projects and get work done. Um, so let's see. Erica's follow-up. Um, a couple questions came in while I was yabbering real quick. We might go a couple minutes over. Pat, let me do Erica's follow-up question. As a follow-up, she lives in a high fire zone on a private road. Their mountains very much overgrown, especially at the bottom of the road. Their POA, it's like an HOA, but it's a private property owners association, excuse me, is looking for a way to get this cleaned up. Where do we start? Yeah, definitely Measure H can help with that, Erica. And then if it looks like we could use some help from Blue Forest, we'll reach out to them as well. Or you can independently. That's fine too. And then Pat also writes, as opposed to financing a proposed project that isn't funded yet, how does Blue Forest evaluate a project that's already funded, but it involves a large scale bridge loans to cover expenses till funder pays up? Any red flag funders you stay away from? I'm not, before you answer that, I want to add to that.
Mm.
Um, for that bridge loan, if you will, how long does it take to get that? Because we have a couple CAL FIRE grants and other grants we're running right now where, the time between we submit a financial report and the time we get funded is around 90 days right now. And then if Roberta screws up on how she inputs the data into the system, it's even protracted longer before we get a check from
Yeah.
our funder. So what does your timeline there in terms of funding look like?
Yeah. I mean, that's really our sweet spot if there are cash flow needs like this. So we can provide that loan within max 10 days after getting an invoice. So that can really, really help. The FRB is effectively a bridge loan, and it's just a very, very quick turnaround. If there are large projects or medium-sized projects with these kind of cash flow constraints, that is totally something we'd be excited to hear more about.
Yeah, perfect. All right, at that, I think that's all the questions. Let's see, got Pat, got Erica. Yeah, and we're about out of time. So thank you, Ariella, for doing the presentation. I'm curious to see how many views we get on YouTube after it's posted up. And great information, very helpful. It's one more resource folks can use to help, get some work done out there and help, make the forest healthier, better, and as a byproduct of that, safer from wildfire. So, and then thanks, Fire Safe Sonoma team. Thanks, Rebecca and Emily and our four fellows, Aiden, Malia, Julie, and Melina. Thank you all for your help. And probably most importantly, we wouldn't be doing this without the viewers, the folks that come and share their ideas, thoughts, and questions, and show up every month to our speaker series. So thank you all so very much. Yeah, let's go forth and conquer. Let's make it safe and healthy for everyone. All right, with that, we'll see you guys next month. Shoot, forgot who we're having next month. Aiden, can you help me out, or one of the fellas? Get somebody unmute and help us out with who we have next month. Not hearing anyone.
I can share. So next month we have Jen Roberts, the community education specialist and landscape designer with the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, the UC Master Gardeners of Sonoma County and Habitat Corridor Project, and she's going to be speaking about resilient landscaping in the defensible space zone.
Thank you, appreciate it. I see now where it's written in the script. I just couldn't
No
find it. All right. Again, thank you guys all for attending our speaker series. Yeah, you guys make this all possible, and hopefully this is of use to you and of some value to you folks out there who come to visit us every month. All right. We'll see you guys next month. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks.